Very much. How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to the show. We are going to be discussing the fallout, the results of the aftermath of the US-China Trump in Beijing, as I've called it, strategic meeting, what I called strategic reconnaissance in one interview another day ago, but some people said it was a reset. Other people are now calling it a nothing burger. And that's largely because there's been a lot of pleasantries at this state visit of the US president and his entourage to China, but not many promises. And to dissect what we've seen, they might have left already. We're still seeing the final moments perhaps tonight, but is George, I always forget your name. George, how do I say it? Beebe. Yeah, okay. But yeah, it's lovely to have you back, George. You are the Director of Grand Strategy at the Quincy Institute. And I promise I'll get your name right next time. But you look at grand strategy, you look at world order, you look at great power competition, very much my home as well. And I was just wondering, in the run-up to this, what were you expecting? And now that it's finished, how do you find it's gone?
Well, I was expecting pretty much what happened. I didn't expect a lot of negative headlines to come out of this. I think both sides had a strong interest in making sure that there wasn't even greater turbulence in the bilateral relationship than there already is, especially given all the turbulence in other parts of the world right now. I think each side wants to portray an image of stability. I think the Chinese in particular want that. And if you look at their summary of the visit, I think they emphasized that the two presidents had made headway on what they called constructive strategic stability in the world. And I think that reflects some basic satisfaction in China with the way things are going for them right now. Now, the United States, I'm not sure, is quite so complacent about the direction of events in the world. We've got some problems. I think that the top of that list is the war with Iran. And if you look at how the United States played this visit, it did emphasize that China agreed that Iran shouldn't have a nuclear weapon. China agreed that the Strait of Hormuz should be open. China agreed to purchase oil from the United States to help make up for some of the deficiencies in the supply it gets through the Strait of Hormuz from Iran. And as well, I think the Trump side of this emphasized Chinese trade and investment, purchasing Boeing aircraft, for example, agreeing to buy U.S. agricultural products. These are all things that focus on making progress on things where the United States really feels the need for progress. And what was notable, I think, about this meeting was that the Chinese said, fine, we're willing to let President Trump have some things out of this that he can portray as progress. And I think for Trump's part, he allowed the Chinese to emphasize those aspects of discussions that they wanted to emphasize. Broader strategic stability, changes in the world, Taiwan, for example, those are all much bigger issues for them.
Yeah, it seems to me that Trump has said that he says one of his more recent statements in the past couple of hours was that he made no commitment either way to Xi on Taiwan. Now, obviously, Taiwan is probably the biggest division point. I don't know if it was the biggest discussion point, but certainly it was the biggest point of division between the two. But from my perspective, and I'm interested for your point on this, is that this is a tumultuous time for Taiwan. They've been receiving a huge multi-billion-dollar package back in December from the US. And there was a delegation that went over with some important Congress people, part of some committees, I think, in DC. But other than that, Trump's statements are, well, as usual, kind of opposite or contradict that. He's growing impatient with the lack of independence, autonomy for them, seeking their own defense. The head of the KMT, I think, went to China last month to meet President Xi, which is a big deal. So there seems to be quite a big question mark over America or Trump's commitment to Taiwan in any hypothetical escalation, right?
Well, yeah, and I think to wrap things up in a sentence, I think Trump continued a policy that the United States has long pursued on this issue, which is strategic ambiguity. He did not want to. Sure, he did not want to commit one way or the other. He did not tell Xi that we are going to go to war to defend Taiwan. He also didn't tell them that we will not. And I think that ambiguity is constructive in this case. We want some doubt in the Chinese minds about what exactly the United States would do without committing ourselves to a specific course of action, depending on how circumstances unfold. And I think that's the right place for us to be on this issue right now. Now, Trump also said some things that I think one could infer to mean that he is not at all eager for any kind of a Taiwan war scenario, understandably so. But he noted on the plane that the last thing we need is a war 9,500 miles away that we get sucked into. So,
well, George, if I can just challenge you on that point, though, because isn't there a difference between ambiguity, which is based on deliberate intent, right? Strategic ambiguity under the Taiwan Relations Act is a very intended policy by the US government, whatever, America. But ambiguity in Trump's sense, I don't think is based on that. I think it's more he just doesn't know what he prefers, right? A lack of decisiveness.
Well, that may be true. I think I suppose I'm giving President Trump some credit here for having thought through this issue. I imagine that he has. This is an issue that has been much discussed and debated. I'm sure his aides have talked to him about this extensively. So I don't really doubt that ambiguity in his own words reflected a conscious decision on his part to pursue the matter of policy.
Fair enough. No, I promise myself going forward, I'm going to be a little bit more provocative or challenging in my questions. So, no, everybody, you're seeing a new and improved interviewer in Pyotr today. No, I'm kidding. But I think that's an interesting point because for me, I had a great conversation yesterday with now that I want to mention his name, I've completely forgotten who it was. Tom Nichols of The Atlantic about domestic American politics. And it was very interesting to sort of dissect from his perspective about Trump's approach to foreign policy vis-a-vis domestic affairs as well. But so, Taiwan aside, obviously, I think the main discussion point was around Iran. And it looks to me like, as you say, I agree with your perspective that I think this was more Beijing or Xi being just, we agree, but we aren't committing to sort of thing. There's no follow through in action yet. But correct me if wrong, don't you think that it's within China's interests to get some kind of situation resolved over the strait? They have reserves in terms of energy.
Absolutely. And frankly, it's in Trump's own interest to get Chinese help on this. The problem here is one of optics. If we're going to get the Iranians to compromise on some things, and I think there's some reason to believe that they have a national interest here in getting sanctions relief, for example, and not being perpetually at war with the United States, which is extraordinarily destructive for Iran and dangerous, I think, for them. So they have a reason to want this war to end, but they're not going to capitulate to all of America's demands on this. So what I think the United States wants is the best deal possible, something that Trump can point to as an accomplishment. And to do that, I think he's going to need some Chinese help. Now, we're doing this in a way that does not give China center stage, because Pakistan, which works very closely with the Chinese, has had a long-standing strategic relationship with China. They are serving as a mediator in a way that can both help Iran and the United States come to terms, but also communicate to the Iranians what China's own preferences are in all of this. And I think that suits President Trump just fine, because it allows China to exert influence over this behind the scenes. It doesn't have the optic of Trump coming to Beijing as a supplicant, asking or begging for China's help to get out of the war that Trump got himself into. But nonetheless, I'm sure there was a constructive discussion about the way forward on Iran. And I think both the Americans and the Chinese have reasons to want this war to end.
No, they do very much. But, you know, can we be honest here that the Chinese have the upper hand, right? It's not a case of this is close. One is clearly winning more than the other, or you disagree with such a simplistic interpretation?
Well, I don't think the Chinese have an urgency to get this war resolved that is quite as pressing as Trump's own urgency. Time is very much not on Trump's side here. The longer this war goes on, the more economic trouble will spread. The more Americans are going to feel the effects of that economic turbulence, particularly at the gas pumps. And we have the approach of midterms in November. And if the world is in recession or on the brink of recession going into those votes, I think that bodes very ill for President Trump and the Republican Party, and he knows that full well. So there is time pressure to get this situation resolved sooner rather than later. He also has other issues on his plate that are being crowded out by the Iran situation. Ukraine, for example, trying to get a peaceful settlement there, put the relationship with Russia and Europe on a much more positive track. Very hard to do that while this war with Iran is unsettled. That interferes with our ability to make progress on other issues. So I think the Chinese, by contrast, they can last through this situation for a much longer period than Trump can. Would they like this resolved? Yes. Does it have to be resolved ASAP from their point of view? No, I don't think so.
But who has the greater, as I've asked to plenty of the guests that we've had on the show in the past, George, do you agree that there's a difference between strategic patience and strategic endurance? Maybe it's a subtle difference, or there's no such thing to you. But, for me, strategic patience in terms gives that there's a certain luxury of time, versus endurance, which means you have to endure based on the situation. You have no other choice, which the Iranians don't. It's not all honky-dory. The political system may be functioning more than people like to claim that it is, but the economy is shot, and by extension, therefore, it affects Chinese interests as well.
No, I think that's a fair assessment. Yes.
Okay, moving on. No, I'm just interested. So what about this idea, therefore, that Trump has a sort of indifference to China's relationship to Iran, based on some of the remarks he said in the past, that I think it was when it was discovered that the Chinese were going to be selling a lot of arms to the Iranians after the intensity of March aerial campaign. Trump sort of reacted to a reporter's question by being, well, we do it to others as well, or we also do it. Is that... Explain that.
Yeah, he did the same thing in response to remarks that the Russians were sharing intelligence with the Iranians. And I think to some degree, he has to downplay this. These reports are being used by Trump opponents to attack him. So he wants to downplay the significance of all of this and put it in a bigger perspective, so that these kinds of reports don't attract more attention than they otherwise might. If he throws a fit over this and attempts to call out the Chinese and the Russians and demand that they stop all this. Number one, he knows that he has very little leverage to employ to coerce them into changing that sort of support, and also simply makes his own policy in getting into this war in Iran look all the more misguided. So I think he probably is somewhere in between in his own feelings. He's probably not happy that the Russians and Chinese are providing this kind of support to Iran, but also does not want to add more fuel to the public discussion about this.
That makes sense. Okay, moving on from Iran then, because I think that is, well, no, actually, one last question. So in what capacity do you think the Chinese can, after the meetings that we've now seen between the two sides, how much do you think China can sway the IOGC? Do you think they will? Not at the behest of the United States, but just because they finally think that it's time?
I think they have a fair amount of influence because the Iranians need to sell energy, and the Chinese are their biggest market, and the number of places in the world where Iran really can sell this energy is fairly limited. So that Chinese market is very important to them. They're also going to need to rebuild. They're going to need to reconstruct once this war is finally over, and they have to repair the damage that has been done. And again, who in the world is going to finance that sort of thing? Who is going to be involved in the reconstruction? Who's going to provide the money for that sort of thing? Right now, it certainly doesn't look like it's going to come from the GCC, given everything that's happened. And the Europeans can't afford it. The United States certainly is going to pay for it. So these kinds of realities, I think, do provide the Chinese with some leverage over the Iranians. And plus, they can help with things like arms sales and other kinds of technologies that I think the Iranians very much are interested in acquiring. So provided the Chinese want what I would call a reasonable settlement, one that ensures that Iran is not going to have a nuclear weapons program, and one that will bring lasting stability between the United States and Iran and in the broader Middle East, which again, I think is very much in China's interest to have that kind of stability, and free flow of commerce through the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz. Provided that those are all a part of a deal, I think the Chinese will use influence over the Iranians to convince them that this is the best thing they're going to get.
Interesting. I guess it's very difficult to tell really where the two sides are going right now. Trump just changes his tune on a daily basis, and the diplomatic front of the Iranian war has slowed because of all the attention and Trump's attention on China. But maybe we're back to square one as of tomorrow or over the weekend. Preferably not. I need a good night's sleep. But George, I mean, there is obviously a big emphasis here on AI, robotics, advanced tech. What do you think, if anything, we could see come out of that area? These two sides, look at the entourage that was with Trump, you know, Musk, Cook, the other ones, I forget their names, BlackRock CEO. What does that tell us about the priorities of the Trump administration to you?
Well, I think that tells us a lot about his emphasis on investment and trade, on strong terms of trade, and a rebalancing of the relationship that he regards as fairer terms of trade between the United States and China. But I don't think he wants to do this in a way that really causes damage to the relationship. We are so interdependent. We're a bit like Siamese twins at this point economically. And if we try to separate them, both of the twins are likely to suffer fatal injuries. So the trick here is, how do you improve this relationship without fatally undermining it, which would be a big problem for the world, as well as for both the United States and China. AI, I think the best you can hope for at this point is to talk about some tentative rules of the road. What are the dangers that we face in developing this technology? How do we minimize the likelihood that bad things, catastrophic things, could come out of this? I think the Chinese want to talk about that. I think we do as well, but we also don't want to undermine our ability to develop this technology and to take advantage of the things that it can do. And this is a very, very tricky issue, because obviously one area of application for artificial intelligence is in the military and security area. And we are very wary of the possibility that the Chinese might achieve some breakthroughs that would put us in a much less secure position militarily. And the Chinese are wary of the opposite scenario, where we have some breakthroughs that greatly disadvantage their own security. So I think the trick here is, how do you manage this issue in a way that allows the developers on both sides to pursue things they think they've got to pursue and is in their interest to pursue, but also cooperate on those things where both sides recognize, hey, this could be mutually damaging. And I think we're in the very early stages of these discussions. So we've got a long way to go before we're going to be making substantial progress on this issue.
I was going to say, but George, like, how does that work in a sense of, we go there, we're all hunky-dory or cheery with each other, but actually look at the policies, right? Trump has started this whole effort to decouple, which is complete nonsense given how integrated the countries are, but to at least, reduce reliance on one another, versus the pleasantries, right? Clearly the US doesn't trust China, the Chinese don't trust the Americans. This is the first head of state visit in 9 years for Trump. It's clearly, doesn't that represent just how little we're actually ever going to get anywhere? And largely it's quite gloomy out there.
It represents how difficult this is. I'm not so pessimistic to say that we can't ever get anywhere, but I think fundamentally, if you back up a little bit here and look at the bigger picture, the threat that China poses, and I know there are a lot of people that don't like that word threat and insist that China isn't threatening. We can't use that word. So for those in the audience that object to that word, I'll use the word challenge. The challenge that China poses for the United States is unlike anything we've ever faced in our history. The Soviet Union during the Cold War was a military peer of the United States, but economically not integrated into the world. And its commercial technology was generations behind that of the United States and its Western partners. And so we could contain the Soviet Union. And it was largely an ideological and military competition, but not an economic and technological competition for the most part, with the exception of space technology. And so the Soviet Union was an adversary that could be contained as a result. China is completely different. China is deeply integrated into the world economy, deeply integrated into the American economy. It is an economic peer and a technological peer in a lot of areas. In some areas, China's technology is ahead of that of the United States. And so we've got a country that is increasingly a military rival, but also so integrated and so vital to our own economy that you can't really contain it the way we did with the Soviet Union. So we're trying to figure out, how do you deal with a challenge like this? And again, I think we're early on in our thinking about how you wrestle with this kind of conundrum. You can't simply decouple the economy. You can't stop trading without grave damage to your own economy. So you have to compete and cooperate at the same time. How do you do that? I'm not sure we figured that out. We're still thinking this through. And how do you manage the situation so that as you compete technologically and geopolitically, you don't get yourself into an actual military confrontation, because that would go very poorly for everybody involved.
Yeah, oh no, go on. I'll jump in after your other point.
So I think this is, you can't look at the history books of the United States anyway and say, oh, we have a model for how you handle a challenge like this. We don't. I'm not aware of one. And all of that comes to a head with artificial intelligence, which has both economic and military applications, and directly connected to things like energy supplies and supply chains, semiconductor chips, space technology. They all come together in this artificial intelligence world. Mm. And so the conundrum, I think, is really encapsulated in that particular issue. It's a very hard thing to deal with.
Yeah, I want to come to big world order, G2 in a moment. But, you know, the way that I've looked at this, I call it the 3 Cs. We're often defining between competition or cooperation. But I think there's a middle version, which is perhaps more coordination, right? You coordinate on things that you can, like Iran, perhaps, or nuclear proficiency or proliferation, rather, trade, etc. But you're going to inevitably compete on some other stuff, influencing the allegiance of countries or who sort of pivots to who, if you like. And you're going to try and cooperate on some stuff, possibly, but very unlikely. So I don't know. How do you look at the relationship between the two, just very simply? Is it a case of we are inevitably saying we want to cooperate, but it's always reverting to competition? Or is there a degree of coordination depending upon what the issue is? Or am I just trying to sound fancy with lots of academic words?
Well, I don't think it fits neatly into any of those boxes. I think the relationship has elements of all of them. And the question is, how do you ensure that confrontation does not overwhelm those areas where we simply need to coexist or cooperate? And that requires a lot of management, a lot of trial and error, and a lot of discussion over time, and resilience. I think you want to build a relationship that is not susceptible to sudden breaks. You want it to be able to withstand tensions and pressures and crises and survive those things and come out the other end. It's what you might call earthquake proofing the relationship, knowing that there are going to be seismic shifts, and you want the relationship to be able to sway with that and not break. That's not an easy thing to build. And both sides have to understand that they have a self-interest in building that kind of resilience into the relationship, recognizing that there are always going to be elements of competition and areas where our interests will come into conflict.
But how much is this dependent on just Trump? If he's gone, we get, as I was asking again, Tom Nichols yesterday, which people should check out if they haven't already, links in the description, is how do we manage the relationship post-Trump? She's going to live to 150 based on what he was saying to President Putin. That's a flashback, guys, to what was supposedly a recorded conversation between the two leaders about, 6 months ago? Obviously, I think kind of nonsense, but how much is this dependent on the individual leaders themselves and their personal views of the world?
Well, these relationships are oftentimes very personal. These leaders do pay a lot of attention to the individuals that they're interacting with. And so that is a factor. And obviously, President Trump is what I would call a big personality. He has a unique style, and he conducts foreign affairs and runs his government in ways that I think are unique in American history, and not particularly structured and orderly and regular. And so that is a factor that you have to take into account so long as he is in the presidency. But there are also structural elements to this relationship, things that are going to endure regardless of who is in the White House. And I think if you look at the transition from the first Trump administration to Biden and then back to Trump again in his second term, there are strong elements of continuity in what the Biden administration did vis-a-vis China. Major parts of Trump's first term approach to China that continued under Biden. So I think the specific policies may vary in their details and how they're attempting to accomplish the goals that they're pursuing. But I think the fundamental objectives that we're going to be attempting to achieve vis-a-vis China aren't going to change a lot after Trump leaves office. We're still going to have these same challenges. How do you compete without undermining the mutual interest we have in economic cooperation? How do you deal with the paucity of trust in the relationship? How do you ensure that geopolitical competition doesn't spill into direct warfare? Those issues are not going to go away. And I think we're going to see strong elements of continuity in the White House, I think, after Trump and how we pursue those things. Interesting.
Quite a lot of debate on that. Now, what, you really think that Gavin Newsom will carry on the same as Marco Rubio or JD Vance would? Those three names are the ones that come to mind. Maybe there's a fourth candidate. We don't know. It's obviously too early to really tell. But what if AOC won? What if AOC decides to put her hat in the ring, George, and she wins, right? We're going to see the continuity with China and foreign policy?
Well, last I heard, she was having some struggles even understanding what the names of the policies and the issues were on this matter. But look, I think any president is going to look at the challenges that we face and look at the tools that we bring to bear on this. And there's not a lot of room for radical change in all of this. For example, I can't see a president saying, we now support Taiwanese independence, which would mean a war across the Taiwan Strait, and would very much mean that the United States would be dragged into a direct conflict with China, which would not go well for anybody concerned. And I can't see a president diverting from the policy that we have on that matter. Could we see some changes on what kinds of arms we might want to supply to the Taiwanese, the volumes of arms that we might want to provide? Yeah, sure. But here again, if you look at what we're actually capable of producing and selling right now, there's not a lot of capacity here in U.S. defense industry. We're our own stockpiles have been overtaxed through what we've provided to the Ukrainians over the past several years, what we've used in the Middle East against Iran last year and this year. Our producers have got years of backlogs just to replenish things that we've used up. Then you're talking about wanting to develop new advanced weapon systems to help us in some sort of future war contingency, wherever that might be. that doesn't leave a lot of extra for selling to countries that also want to purchase from the United States. So do we have some room in what we could provide and how? Sure. Can we see huge fluctuations in how a new president might pursue that? I'm not sure that we do. You could come into office and say, we need to make a lot more semiconductor chips in the United States. Well, fine. A lot of people think that's a great idea. Can we do it? Apple a few years ago tried to do this and failed. Why? We don't have the labor force with the skills and the education and the ability to do this on a big scale. And it takes time to develop this sort of thing. So there are these realities that I think impose limits on what we can do and how quickly.
Yeah, but China's got a huge set of issues as well, right? I'm not going to say China's collapsing. I'm not one of those people, but you've got a structural housing issue. Yep. You've got regional economic considerations now. More and more regional, provincial authorities are facing funding shortages, if I remember correctly. But of course, the main thing, which is from my background with demography, is the population imbalance. The demographic dividend of the country has run out. They were overtaken by India 3 years ago. They had their first decline in population 3 years ago. And then we're not even getting into the one-child policy remnants, the growing dependency ratio. There's a lot of issues.
They really can't solve it. I mean, there's not much that they can do. And they know they've got a problem. They're trying to solve it, and it's quite resistant to solutions. So, yeah, no, China certainly has lots of problems. There's no question about it.
But which one's more of a pressing matter then to you, George? Who has the greatest essence of time on their side?
Well, that's very hard to say. When you start projecting 5, 10, 20 years out into the future, there's so many variables, so much can change. It's really a very low confidence projection. So, if the United States gets its act together domestically, generates the kind of innovations that we historically have been so good at, and mobilizes all our human capital effectively, which again has long been a strength of the United States. I think there are lots of reasons to think that we could be 10, 20 years from now in a very advantageous position. But you could also project some of the trends you see inside the United States right now and say, boy, we're headed on a downward trajectory. Very, very hard to say. I have a lot of faith in America's can-do ability. We're able to remake ourselves, and of all the societies in the world, I think we have reason for optimism that we can deal with our problems pragmatically, overcome them, and put ourselves on a very positive trajectory. But you can't take that for granted. There are some very serious problems in the United States right now, and there's no guarantee that we'll find our way out of the situation that we're in.
Well, this comes back to, for me, the crux of the argument between the world orders kind of thing. What kind of political system or form of governance do you want? Do you want a more open, liberal, but therefore economically inconsistent type of structure, or do you want a more centralized form of governance, but therefore there's continuous economic policies? Because, in the US, you're changing your policies almost every 2 years because if the midterms severely change things, then it blocks the president. Whereas the Chinese, they can just continue continuously because it's a one-party state. But, with all that in mind, a couple of years ago, I had Francis Fukuyama to talk about this, and it was simply, are we in a new world order? Is this going back to a new Cold War, George? Does it resemble the same? To me, it doesn't, but
I don't think it resembles the old Cold War, no. As I mentioned earlier, I think there's some very fundamental differences between that bipolar world and the one we're in right now. I would say, though, that there are probably some things that are not going to change back to the way they were in the post-Cold War period. You know, after we, quote unquote, won that Cold War, we thought we had an opportunity essentially to remake other countries in our image, to westernize them. We undertook this both in the former Soviet Union and former Warsaw Pact and in the Middle East, thinking that this would result in freer, more prosperous, more stable, more friendly countries. And for the most part, this was an objective that was beyond our capabilities. And I think we've learned our lesson there, that we shouldn't be too ambitious about our ability to re-engineer other countries socially and politically. So my guess is that that phase of American foreign policy peaked after the end of the Cold War, when we were brimming with confidence and we had no peer rivals in the world. But we're not in that kind of world anymore. We're going to have peer competitors, I think, for quite a number of decades moving forward. And I think as a result, we're going to have to focus on more traditional forms of statecraft and much less on transformational diplomacy as we did in the post-Cold War period. So I think that's going to be a fundamental change.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of leads me to the last thing, which is what I made in my analysis, which I've posted in the comments of people if they're interested, which is simply, you know, are we seeing this idea of a G2 world? For context, everyone, there was this concept coined, I think, about 20 years ago, arguing that the two largest powers would largely define where we all go, where everything else goes. They sort of micromanage everything. They coexist, and whether or not there are two poles, sort of, it's slightly different to the idea of bipolar, because that looks more at sort of the distinction, whilst G2, I think, is more a uniformed idea that the two are sort of co-managing it. Any thoughts on that? Is it a largely defunct concept in your mind? Is it just academics liking to be new and innovative with terms?
I think if we wind up in a world where the Chinese and Americans are by far the dominant powers, that competition between those two poles will overwhelm their ability to manage the world order, so to speak. I think if we're going to get a quote unquote managed world order, it would have to look more like the concert of Europe in the 19th century, where you have multiple great powers whose, you know, capabilities and might will, of course, vary from country to country, but all of them will have enough freedom of maneuver that they're going to be seated at the board, at the table of great powers, and can among themselves understand what the rules of the game are, you know, what's inbounds, what's out of bounds, and make sure that the balance of power among them does not get so distorted that it becomes unstable. I think that's the kind of situation that we could aspire to. Not easy to get there. It requires a high degree of statesmanship, a lot of finely tuned diplomacy for that to work out. And right now, I'm not sure any of the great powers is in a position really to do that effectively. But I think that's the kind of thing that we might realistically aspire to.
So a multipolar world, then, as everyone seems to jump on the bandwagon of saying multipolar world without really understanding what that means.
Yeah, you could also use the word polycentric, because
I
that.
prefer that. That sounds different, and therefore I will say that.
Yeah.
Okay, polycentric, or as one academic bunch, I think, at the Munich Security Conference last year said, a multiplex world, which was, I think people are just too busy with their time. But George, it's been an absolute pleasure. Any final remarks or takeaways you'd like to emphasize to the audience before we call it an afternoon here on the Global Gambit?
Nope, great. Good conversation. Thanks for having me on.
As always, everyone watching, do be sure to follow George's work. You'll find a link to his profile in the description. Check out the videos that I also mentioned in the description. And of course, like the video and subscribe. And you'll see us on the next conversation here. And well, I wish you all a pleasant afternoon. Speak soon.